It was the annual gathering at the highly exclusive Revere Hotel, and Henry was dreading every minute of it. The luxurious ballroom was awash in opulence. Glistening chandeliers cast their glow on the high-end tuxedos and sparkling evening gowns. The air was thick with the smell of expensive perfumes and the faint trace of the latest colognes, almost as if money itself hung in the air like a cloud. His cousins, all successful businessmen and women, gathered in groups, loudly exchanging tales of their extravagant vacations, new acquisitions, and lucrative deals. Henry, on the other hand, stood quietly by the window, his plain dark suit making him blend into the background. His dark hair was neatly combed, and his eyes scanned the room with an air of detachment as he tried to avoid the scrutinizing gazes of his family. As always, he was the quiet one, overlooked and undervalued, the perfect background player in a family where success was defined only by fortune and status. He reached for a glass of champagne and hid a small smirk behind it, trying not to let their casual jabs sting too much. And just as he thought he could escape, the familiar voice of his Aunt Eleanor sliced through the chatter. "Henry," she called, her eyes scanning the room before landing on him. "Still working as a consultant?" Henry's heart sank as Aunt Eleanor's voice carried through the ballroom. He could already hear the condescending tone, the mockery that had been all too familiar at these events. "Still consulting, huh? Haven't you thought about getting a real job?" she added, raising an eyebrow as she sipped her martini. Her tone was filled with disbelief, almost as if she couldn't fathom how anyone could be content with a job that wasn't high-profile or glamorous. Henry's gaze drifted across the room to his cousins. Lucas, freshly appointed CEO of his father's tech empire, was engrossed in a conversation about acquisitions. Isabel, his older cousin, had just closed a multi-million-dollar deal with an international firm. All around him, success was being flaunted like the latest fashion trends, and he was supposed to fit in with this world. Taking a deep breath, Henry calmly adjusted his tie. "I'm doing well, thank you," he replied, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He had long stopped explaining himself to his relatives, but something inside him was different tonight. He was no longer the quiet, invisible one. A fire had started burning in him, something he had kept hidden for years. This wasn't just about proving them wrong anymore. It was about showing them that success didn't always wear designer suits and come in the form of inherited wealth. The room buzzed with idle chatter, but Henry's mind was elsewhere. As he thought about the way they all looked at him, like a misfit, someone who didn't belong in their world, his mind began to hatch a plan. What if the family's idea of success, the very thing they all so proudly displayed, was a sham? What if there was a different way to do business, something that didn't rely on a network of connections and the manipulation of companies for personal gain? He had spent the last decade quietly building his own empire. In the shadows, away from prying eyes, he had established his consulting firm, Zenith Strategies. It started small, just him and a handful of trusted colleagues. They'd worked on major corporate restructuring, saving struggling companies from falling into the hands of bigger, greedier corporations. What his family didn't know was that Henry was the one who had saved the companies they tried to buy out. He had been working against them, undermining their predatory acquisitions one by one, without them ever realizing. And now, standing in the middle of this high society circus, he had one thought. It was time to make them all understand. It was time for them to see who he truly was. Not the invisible cousin they had always underestimated, but the mastermind behind a multi-billion-dollar consulting firm that was about to change everything. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. A message from his assistant, Claire, popped up. "Emergency meeting tomorrow, 9 a.m. Zenith's takeover of Westfield Industries goes public. Urgent response needed." He read the message twice, the significance of the words sinking in. This was it. Tomorrow morning his family would be sitting at the table with him, expecting to bully their way into a merger, only to find out the tables had turned. Henry wasn't a secretary anymore. He was the one calling the shots. He took another sip of his champagne, the sharp taste a reminder of just how far he had come. A small, satisfied smile crossed his lips as he turned to face Aunt Eleanor. "Thank you, Aunt Eleanor. I should probably get going," he said smoothly. "I have an important meeting tomorrow." As he made his way out of the ballroom, Henry knew one thing for certain. This would be the night they would all remember, the night the world would see him for who he really was, and they would finally understand just how wrong they had been to dismiss him. The morning of the meeting arrived too quickly, but Henry was ready. The moment he stepped into the sleek, glass-walled skyscraper where Zenith Strategies had its headquarters, he felt the familiar buzz of power running through his veins. He had worked tirelessly to get here, and today it was all going to pay off. The polished floors reflected his black suit, the dark color a deliberate choice. He was no longer the invisible, unassuming cousin. He was a force to be reckoned with. As he entered the private elevator that would take him up to the executive floor, he checked his watch. 8:45 a.m. His assistant Claire was already waiting for him, her tablet in hand and a knowing smile on her face. "Everything's set, Mr. Dorsey. The Wilson Ventures team is already in the conference room. They're a bit early, but they look anxious." Henry nodded, his lips curving slightly. He knew what that meant. His uncle, William, and cousins always came with an air of arrogance, believing that their name alone could bulldoze any resistance. But today, it was a different story. "What's the word on the room?" Henry asked as they walked toward the conference room. Claire's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Your Aunt Eleanor is there, of course, looking unimpressed. Your cousin Lucas, too, along with a few of their lawyers. But the real surprise?" She paused for effect. "Ethan. He insisted on coming himself to handle the legal details." Henry allowed himself a small chuckle. Ethan, with his flashy suits and overconfidence, had been the one to tell him that he would never amount to anything more than a secretary. Well, today would show Ethan just how wrong he was. "Perfect," Henry said, his voice calm, controlled. "Let's make sure they're all on edge." As the elevator doors opened to the executive floor, Henry couldn't help but feel the rush of anticipation. This was his moment, when everything he had worked for would become undeniable. He walked toward the conference room, his heels echoing off the polished floors, his expression composed but burning with determination. He couldn't wait to see the looks on their faces. The room was large, glass walls offering a view of the bustling city below. His uncle sat at the head of the table, his face scrunched in concentration as he reviewed papers. Lucas and Ethan flanked him on either side, both of them speaking in hushed tones, no doubt strategizing their next move. Aunt Eleanor was seated off to the side, looking disinterested as always. The familiar smug expressions on their faces were exactly as he remembered, but this time they would not get away with it. Henry walked in without hesitation, his steps measured and deliberate. The conversation died instantly as they all looked up at him, confusion written across their faces. Ethan's mouth opened in surprise. Lucas straightened in his seat, his eyes narrowing. His aunt, who had been checking her manicure, finally looked up at him as if she had just seen a ghost. "What are you doing here?" Ethan demanded, his voice laced with disbelief. "Where's the actual CEO of Zenith, the person we're supposed to meet?" Henry didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step forward, letting the silence build. The tension was palpable. He could feel the power shifting in the room. It was no longer about family legacy or wealth. It was about control. And for the first time in his life, Henry had it. "I'm the CEO," Henry said, his voice steady and strong, sending a ripple of shock through the room. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, nobody moved. Ethan's face drained of color. Lucas's jaw dropped. Aunt Eleanor's expression morphed from indifference to a mixture of confusion and anger. Henry stood at the head of the table, watching their stunned reactions with a sense of satisfaction. There was no longer any question about who held the power. "What's this nonsense?" Uncle William barked, recovering first from the shock. "You, CEO? You've been nothing but a lowly assistant all these years?" His voice trembled with rage, but it only made Henry stand taller, more assured. "That's the story you've all believed, isn't it?" Henry replied calmly. "You've all been so sure of your superiority, so sure I was just here to serve. But what if I told you I've been running a multi-billion-dollar empire for the last 10 years, without any of you ever noticing?" The silence that followed was deafening. The looks of disbelief on their faces were priceless. Ethan, the lawyer, the one who had always looked down on him, was now speechless. Henry pulled out his phone, flicking through the apps before projecting the latest financial statements onto the large screen at the front of the room. The numbers were staggering. "This," he said, gesturing to the numbers, "is what you've all been missing." He could hear his family's collective gasp as the realization hit. They weren't just dealing with a secretary. They were facing the very CEO they had mocked, the one they had underestimated for all these years. The room was filled with tension, the air so thick that Henry could almost taste it. His family sat there stunned, each of them struggling to process what had just unfolded. The man they had all written off as a lowly assistant was now standing before them as the head of a multi-billion-dollar company. Uncle William's face was a shade of purple that Henry had never seen before, and his eyes burned with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "This is absurd," he spat. "You're nothing but a secretary. How dare you stand there and claim to be the CEO?" Henry's lips curled into a slight, almost pitying smile. He had heard these words, or something similar, countless times throughout his life. His family's dismissal of him had been the constant backdrop to his journey. They had been so certain that they knew who he was and where he belonged. They were wrong. He took a step forward, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of years of hidden determination. "You never looked beyond what you wanted to see. You saw me as nothing more than a secretary, and that's exactly what I allowed you to believe." Aunt Eleanor shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her perfectly manicured hands shaking slightly as she placed her champagne glass down on the table. This is a joke, Henry," she muttered, almost pleading with him to admit that it was all some kind of elaborate prank. Henry shook his head slowly. "It's not a joke, Aunt Eleanor. It's reality." The disbelief on their faces made his heart race with both excitement and a sense of satisfaction. He had played the game perfectly, let them underestimate him, made himself invisible in their eyes, all the while building something far more powerful than any of them could have imagined. Henry gestured to the screen where the financials of Zenith Strategies were still projected. "This is real. We've been helping companies thrive, preventing hostile takeovers, saving businesses from the very people sitting at this table." Lucas, who had been the most vocal about Henry's supposed lack of ambition, now stared at the screen in stunned silence. His eyes flickered between the numbers and his cousin. Henry could see the flicker of realization in his eyes, the dawning horror that the empire he had so confidently inherited was nothing more than a house of cards, ready to collapse at any moment. Henry's voice grew stronger as he continued, "You built your wealth by tearing others down. You acquire companies, break them apart, and swallow them whole. My company, on the other hand, exists to build. Build people, build businesses, build a future that doesn't rely on exploitation." The family's once proud faces now appeared strained and uncomfortable. Aunt Eleanor shifted in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she struggled to hold on to her usual air of superiority. Ethan's mouth was hanging open in shock, his sharp suit doing little to conceal his embarrassment. And then Henry turned to face them all, locking eyes with his uncle. "I've been quietly dismantling your business practices for years. The companies you've tried to acquire, I've saved them. Your attempts at takeovers have been thwarted time and time again. Not by luck, but by design. It's ironic, isn't it? You've been destroying the very businesses that I've been trying to protect." Uncle William sputtered, his face twisting with rage and disbelief. "You've been sabotaging us? Your own family?" His voice was strained, almost choking on the words. "I didn't sabotage you, Uncle. I built my own empire. You may have given me nothing, but I've created everything I've ever needed on my own." There was a long pause, and for a brief moment, Henry felt the weight of his words settle in. The tension was palpable, and for the first time in his life, Henry saw his family not as powerful figures who controlled his destiny, but as mere players in a game that was no longer under their control. His eyes moved across the room, meeting each of their gazes, and he could see the shift in their faces, the confidence, the arrogance, the superiority. They were gone. They could no longer deny what they had been blind to for so many years. As the silence stretched on, Henry stood tall, a sense of calm confidence washing over him. He had done it. He had taken back control. He was no longer the invisible cousin, the secretary. He was the one who held the power now. The silence in the room stretched on, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Henry stood at the head of the table, his gaze unwavering, watching the faces of his family. The shock had not yet fully worn off. They were still grappling with the magnitude of what he had just revealed, what he had built, what they had completely missed. Aunt Eleanor, who had always prided herself on knowing everything about everyone, was the first to recover. She smoothed down the front of her dress and cleared her throat, her voice shaky but tinged with desperation. "So what is it that you want, Henry?" she asked, her tone thin with forced politeness. "You've made your point. We're all shocked. But what now?" Henry's lips curled into a slight smile, though it was not one of amusement. It was a smile born of strategy, of control. "What I want," he said slowly, "is simple. I want you to recognize that things have changed." He gestured to the projection still lit on the wall, the numbers still glaring at them with stark clarity. Summit Solutions, my company, is now one of the most influential consulting firms in the world. We have the power to save companies, reshape industries, and yes, even create real value where others only see profit to be extracted. But I can't do that alone. I need the resources, the connections that only you can bring. Henry paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the air, watching his family absorb the implications. Their arrogance had always been built on the fact that they had everything, wealth, connections, and the belief that their legacy would last forever. But now he was offering them something they hadn't expected, a chance to be part of a new world, one that didn't rely on tearing down others, but on building them up. "Your empire," Henry continued, "is built on predatory practices, acquisitions that strip companies of their value. You've been playing in a game that's ending. The world is changing, and if you want to survive, you'll need to adapt. The future is about restructuring, about finding long-term value, not exploiting weaknesses for short-term gains." He turned to face his uncle, whose face had begun to show signs of cracking under the pressure. "You're about to lose everything, Uncle William, but you don't have to. If you're willing to work with me, if you're willing to change the way your company operates, there's a place for you in Summit Solutions. I'll help you reshape Wilson Ventures into something new, something sustainable." The room fell silent again as Henry's words sank in. This wasn't a threat. This was a proposition. He wasn't asking them to be part of his world because he needed them. He was offering them a chance to be part of something bigger, something that could endure. Aunt Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she processed the offer. "You think you can just waltz in here and turn everything around?" she asked, her voice tight with disdain. You think you can make us believe in your new way of doing business?" Henry stepped closer to the table, meeting her gaze. "I'm not asking you to believe in me, Aunt Eleanor. I'm asking you to see the truth. You've spent your entire life running away from change, holding on to outdated practices, and now you're facing the consequences. But this isn't the end. This is an opportunity for all of us. Together we could build something that lasts, something that truly makes a difference." For the first time in years, Henry saw a flicker of something other than disdain in his family's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They were considering his offer. They were listening. "I'll give you until the end of the day to decide," Henry continued. "Either you join me in building something sustainable, or you stay on the path of destruction. But know this, I'm moving forward, with or without you." With that, Henry turned and walked toward the door. He didn't look back. The decision was now theirs to make. The next few hours felt like a blur to Henry as he returned to his private office. His mind was spinning, a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation bubbling within him. He had just delivered the pitch of his life. He had not only exposed his family's flaws, but offered them a chance to change, to evolve, to finally do something meaningful with the wealth and power they had accumulated over the years. As he sat at his desk, reviewing contracts for the upcoming merger, his phone buzzed. Claire had sent him an urgent message. "The family is meeting without you. They want to discuss your offer. They're nervous, but they're talking. Uncle William is seriously considering it." A small, triumphant smile tugged at his lips. This wasn't the victory he had anticipated, though. He hadn't come here to gloat. In truth, Henry was no longer looking to gain anything from his family. He had already built his empire. What he wanted now wasn't wealth or recognition. It was the kind of change that could ripple outward, one that could challenge an entire system of corporate greed. Henry had learned early in life that power was about control. But true power was about using that control for something more meaningful. His family had always used their power to destroy. He had chosen a different path, one where success was built on integrity, on helping others succeed, and on creating something that could stand the test of time. Over the years, he had watched his family take the easy way out, acquiring struggling businesses at rock-bottom prices, stripping them for parts, and throwing them aside when they were no longer profitable. Henry had always known there was a better way. He had built Zenith Strategies not just to compete with his family, but to challenge the very foundation of what they stood for. The most powerful lesson he had learned, though, was that success doesn't come from showing off, from flaunting wealth, or from shoving others down in the pursuit of power. It came from quietly building, from being patient, and from working in the shadows when no one was watching. And now, it was time for the world to see just how much power he had built, not from the outside, but from within. As the hours passed, Henry continued to grow into the role he had been hiding from for so long. The quiet, invisible cousin was gone, replaced by a leader with vision, with purpose, and with a commitment to making real change. The idea that he was just a secretary had faded into the past. He wasn't just playing the game anymore. He was changing the rules. Claire knocked on his door and entered with a smile. "The family wants to meet you again. They're ready to talk. They've agreed to the merger, but they're asking for some assurances that the changes you've promised are real." Henry rose from his chair, his posture straight, his confidence unwavering. "They'll have what they need," he said calmly. "But the real question is whether they're ready for the kind of business I'm offering. I'm not just giving them a seat at the table. I'm offering them a chance to change, to build something they never imagined they could." As he walked toward the conference room, Henry felt a sense of pride swell inside him. The path had been long and difficult, but this was the moment where it all came together. He wasn't just securing a merger or making a business deal. He was changing the way people saw success And in doing so, he was teaching his family a lesson they would never forget. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about creating something better, something that would outlast all their petty ambitions. He had fought for 10 years to get here, and now he was finally in a position to lead, not from the shadows, but from the front. The final meeting with his family took place in the grand conference room of Zenith Strategies headquarters, but it felt like a full-circle moment for Henry. The towering glass walls that once symbolized corporate power now served as the backdrop for a far more meaningful conversation. This was no longer about money or power. It was about purpose, integrity, and the legacy Henry wanted to create. His family had reluctantly agreed to the terms of the merger. It wasn't an easy decision for them. Uncle William had fought tooth and nail to retain control, and Aunt Eleanor had insisted on maintaining her influence. But when faced with the undeniable facts, Zenith's success, the growing number of clients, and the undeniable shift in business trends, they had no choice but to accept. In the end, it was the only way they could keep their empire from crumbling. As Henry stood at the head of the table, the same place his uncle had always occupied, he looked around at the faces of his family, faces that had once sneered at him, dismissing him as insignificant. Now they looked at him with a mixture of wariness and reluctant respect. "Today marks the beginning of something new," Henry began, his voice calm and confident. "It's not just a new direction for Wilson Ventures. It's a new way of thinking, a new way of doing business." His family shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Henry pressed on. "For too long, we've valued power over people, profit over purpose. But that stops now. Together we can create a future where business is about building people up, not tearing them down. I've spent years proving that success doesn't come from exploiting others. It comes from helping them succeed." He paused, letting his words sink in. The room was silent, but there was something different in the air. A shift, a subtle change in their demeanor. Maybe, just maybe, they were beginning to understand. "For the first time in years, I see a real opportunity for us," Henry continued. "But it's not just about what I can do for you. It's about what we can do together. This is your chance to leave a different kind of legacy. A legacy of rebuilding, of helping businesses grow, of creating value for the long term." He turned to his uncle, his eyes steady and unwavering. "You've taught me many things, Uncle William. You taught me how to play the game, how to survive in a world that values power above all else. But now I want to show you a new way, a way where we build a future that's worth something, not just for us, but for the generations that follow." There was a long pause as Henry's words settled in the room. His family had always been focused on one thing: control. But now, Henry was offering them something far more valuable, a chance to lead with integrity, to change the very nature of what business could be. Aunt Eleanor finally spoke up, her voice softer than it had been before. "So you're saying we can still be part of this new vision?" Henry nodded. "You're not just participants, Aunt Eleanor. You're integral to the future of this company. If you're willing to change, willing to adapt, there's a place for you here." His uncle, who had been silent for most of the conversation, finally spoke. "And if we don't accept?" His voice was still laced with pride, but there was a hint of vulnerability there, too. Henry met his gaze squarely. "Then you will be left behind. You'll continue down a path of destruction, and you'll lose everything you've worked for. But the choice is yours." The room was quiet for a long time, the weight of Henry's words hanging in the air. His family had spent their lives chasing power and wealth, but now they had to confront the truth. Real success wasn't about domination. It was about creating something sustainable, something that could make a real difference. As the meeting came to a close, Henry felt a sense of pride welling up inside him. This was it, the moment when everything he had worked for came to fruition. He wasn't just taking control of a company, he was taking control of his destiny, and in doing so, he was changing the future of his family. The story of Henry's rise from overlooked secretary to CEO of Zenith Strategies teaches us one powerful truth. Success is often built in silence, in the shadows, while others underestimate you. Henry's journey reminds us that we should never let others define our worth or limit our potential. We all have the power to create our own paths, to build something incredible, even when the world tells us we're not enough. What matters most is the vision we hold for ourselves and the perseverance we show in pursuit of our dreams. When others doubt you, when they write you off, that's when your resilience becomes your greatest asset. Instead of seeking validation from those who don't believe in you, focus on the work. Because in the end, actions speak louder than words. Henry's story is a testament to the fact that true success doesn't come from showing off. It comes from staying true to your values, building quietly, and ultimately making a difference. In life, you might encounter people who doubt your abilities or judge you based on your current circumstances. The lesson here is simple. Use their doubts as fuel for your growth. Don't let others' opinions dictate your potential. Focus on honing your skills, building your network, and pursuing your goals with integrity. Remember, success isn't always immediate. It's the result of persistence, consistency, and working towards something meaningful. Don't rush to prove people wrong. Instead, let your actions do the talking. Success will follow when you stay true to your mission, no matter how many obstacles come your way.